This is a reading of Jim Candy, Part 1, Chapter 1. My earliest memory is of an afternoon in June. I was 4 years old, and I was in the backyard with my dad. He just bought me a purple and gold mini football, my first football. He'd marked off an area of our backyard with a white chalk line. "Here's how it works, Mick. You try to run there," he said, pointing behind the line, "and I try to stop you." He shoved the mini football into the crook of my arm, led me to the far end of the yard, went back to the middle, got down on his knees, and yelled, "Go!" I took off running toward the end zone. Our backyard is narrow, his arms are long, and even on his knees he could move fast enough to catch a 4-year-old. Time after time I ran, trying to get by him, but he never let me have anything for nothing, not even then. Here we're introduced to our main character, Mick, and he says one of his earliest memories is when he's 4 years old playing football with his dad in the backyard. And even back then, he says that his dad never let him have anything for nothing, not even then. So he realized even at 4 years old that his dad wasn't going to be Mr. Nice Guy and wasn't going to let him win just because he was a little kid. He was going to have to work hard for everything he got. Over and over, he'd stretch out on one of his arms and tackle me. Sometimes the tears would well up. "There's no crying in football," he'd say, which I guess is a joke from some Tom Hanks movie, and he'd send me back to try again. It is. It's from a movie called A League of Their Own, where Tom Hanks tells these girls that there's no crying in baseball. And then I did it. I zigged when he was expecting a zag, and I was by him. I crossed the chalk line at the end of the yard, my heart pounding. I remember squealing for joy as I turned around. He was lying on the ground, his arms reaching toward me, a huge smile on his face. "Touchdown, Nick Johnson!" he yelled. "Your first touchdown!" All those years, I believed that every kid in the neighborhood was jealous of me. And why not? I'd spent time at the houses of the boys on my block, Philip and Corey and Marcus. I'd seen their dads sprawled out on the sofa. Mostly they ignore me, but if they asked me something, it was always about school. I'd answer, and then they'd go back to their newspaper. These fathers drove delivery trucks or taught high school or worked in office buildings in downtown Seattle. They wore glasses, had close-cropped hair, and either had bellies or were starting to get them. Everything about them seemed puny. My dad was bigger and stronger than any of them. His voice was deeper, his smile wider, his laugh louder. Like me, he has red hair, only his was long and reached his shoulders. He wore muscle t-shirts that showed his tattoos. On one shoulder a dragon, on the other a snake. He kept a keg of beer in the den, and whenever he filled his beer stein, he'd let me sip the foam off the top. The way he looked, the way he acted, those things alone put him a million miles above every other kid's father. But there was one thing that absolutely sealed the deal. My dad was a star. So every kid thinks of their dad differently than what he is in real life, and especially when you're a younger kid, a lot of kids idolize their mother or their father, and that was no different than Mick. But he knew something special was about his dad, and that was that his dad was actually a star. Okay, his dad had been someone important. Our den proved it. It was down in the basement across from my mom's laundry room, and it was filled with scrapbooks and plaques and medals. 2 walls were covered with framed newspaper articles. It was the headlines of those articles that told his story. I used to go downstairs into the den, pick up one of the game balls that he kept in a metal bin in the corner, and walk around and read them, feeling the laces and the leather of the football as I read. Mike Johnson sets high school yardage record. Mike Johnson leads Huskies over USC. Mike Johnson named to all Pac-10 first team. Mike Johnson selected in 3rd round. Sometimes my dad would come in when I was staring at the walls. He'd tell me about a touchdown run he'd made in a rainstorm against Cal or the swing pass in the Sun Bowl that he'd broken for 65 yards. When he finished with one of his stories, he'd point to the 2 bare walls. "Those are yours, Mick," he'd say. "You're going to fill them up with your own headlines." My mom had been a top gymnast at the University of Washington, the same year as my dad was on the football team. She runs around Green Lake every morning, and she used to do the Seattle to Portland bicycle race, so she knows all about competition. But every time she heard my dad talk about me making the headlines, she'd put her hands on my shoulders and look me in the eye with her dark eyes. "You don't have to fill any walls with anything," she'd say. "You just be you." Then she'd point a finger at my dad, and you stop with all that bare wall stuff. My dad would laugh. A little pressure is good for a boy, keeps him on his toes. Even at this young age, Mick realizes that his dad is putting pressure on him. That's a lot of pressure for a parent to point at two empty walls in a house and say, I expect you to fill those walls with newspaper headlines and trophies and different accolades and medals and so forth. That's a lot to live up to, right? You look at this shrine your dad has created in your home of all of his awards. How are you supposed to compare it to that? And Mick's mom realizes that, and that's why she tells her son, like, you just be you, right? You do what you love and don't worry about all the trophies and all of that. But as we're going to find out, Mick does not listen to his mother.